The cruelest thing about losing everything is discovering who was only loving the money. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Walker Global headquarters as Ethan Walker stood frozen in the middle of the executive lobby, watching strangers carry boxes out of the company he had spent 20 years building. The giant gold logo above the reception desk still bore his name, but nobody looked at him anymore. Not the assistants rushing past in heels. Not the security guards avoiding eye contact. Not even the board members who once laughed too loudly at every joke he made. The billionaire who had once appeared on the cover of Forbes 3 times in a single year now stood alone in a wrinkled charcoal coat, holding nothing but a leather duffel bag and the silence of a life collapsing in real time. Across the lobby, massive television screens replayed the same breaking news headline on loop. Walker Global files for emergency bankruptcy. CEO removed by board vote. Ethan stared at the words until they blurred together. Just 6 months ago, he had owned penthouses in Manhattan and Miami, private jets, vineyards in Napa Valley, and enough influence to make senators return his calls within minutes. Now his corporate accounts were frozen. His investors had vanished. And 30 minutes earlier, his wife Rebecca had calmly slid divorce papers across a marble kitchen island while their driver waited downstairs with her luggage. "I can't live like this," she had said softly, barely looking up from her diamond watch. "I married a man who made me feel safe." Then she kissed his cheek like a polite stranger and walked away forever. The memory hit harder than the bankruptcy itself. Ethan adjusted his grip on the duffel bag as the revolving doors opened behind him. Cold November wind swept through the lobby. A young reporter immediately spotted him. "Mr. Walker," she shouted, hurrying forward with a microphone. "Do you have a statement about the fraud investigation?" Another camera flashed. "Did your wife leave before or after the board removed you?" Ethan lowered his eyes and kept walking. Every step echoed against the polished marble floors that once belonged to him. Security opened the doors without a word. Outside, Manhattan looked colder than he remembered. Yellow taxis splashed through rainwater. Steam curled from subway grates. People hurried past under umbrellas while giant LED billboards lit the avenue in blue and white flashes. Nobody recognized him anymore. Or maybe they did and simply did not care. Ethan walked 3 blocks before realizing his driver was not coming. His phone battery died moments later. He checked his wallet. $43 in cash. That was all the billionaire had left in the world tonight. The rain soaked through his coat as he crossed into a quieter neighborhood near Brooklyn. The expensive leather shoes that once stepped across private airport runways now splashed through puddles beside food carts and laundromats glowing under flickering neon signs. Hunger twisted sharply in his stomach. He could not remember the last time he had gone an entire day without eating. Then he saw it. A small silver food truck parked beneath a buzzing street lamp. Steam drifted from the service window into the cold night air, carrying the smell of grilled onions, beef, and fresh bread. A handwritten sign taped to the side read, "Second Chance Kitchen." Ethan slowed without meaning to. Inside the truck, a woman moved quickly between sizzling pans, her blonde hair tied back beneath a dark knit beanie. She looked up casually at first. Then she froze. Completely froze. The metal spatula slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the counter. Her eyes widened as if she had just seen a ghost standing in the rain. Ethan barely noticed. He was too exhausted to care. He stepped closer to the window, water dripping from his sleeves, and quietly asked the one question he never imagined he would ask another human being. "What's the cheapest thing you have?" For a long second, the woman behind the counter did not move at all. Rain crackled softly against the roof of the food truck while the city noise faded somewhere behind Ethan's exhaustion. The smell of grilled onions and melted cheese drifted into the cold air between them. Ethan lowered his eyes awkwardly, suddenly aware of how pathetic he must have looked standing there soaked to the bone with a duffel bag hanging from his shoulder like a man with nowhere left to go. "If you are closed, it is okay," he said quietly. "I can find somewhere else." The woman blinked fast, almost snapping herself back into the moment. "No," she said quickly. "No, we are open." Her voice was softer now, careful, like she was speaking to someone fragile. She bent down to pick up the spatula she had dropped earlier, but Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly. "What is the cheapest thing?" he repeated. "Honestly, anything is fine." The woman stared at him another second before forcing a small smile. "Tonight's special," she said. burger, fries, and coffee. Ethan reached into his wallet immediately. He counted the damp bills slowly beneath the streetlight glow. How much? First customer eats free. Ethan frowned. You do not have to do that. I know. Her smile widened just enough to feel real this time. But I want to. He hesitated, pride tightening in his chest. A year ago, he had tipped valets more than the amount of cash now sitting in his wallet. He had once rented out entire restaurants for investor dinners without checking prices. Accepting free food from a stranger felt strangely heavier than losing the company. I can pay tomorrow, he muttered. You do not owe me anything, she replied gently. Something about the way she said it made Ethan finally nod. Okay, he whispered. The woman turned toward the grill, and Ethan quietly stepped beneath the small awning beside the truck to escape the rain. A tiny portable heater glowed orange near the counter window. It barely fought the November cold, but after hours outside it felt almost comforting. Ethan watched the woman work in silence. She moved quickly and confidently, flipping burgers, salting fries, pouring coffee into a paper cup. Every few seconds she glanced toward him when she thought he was not looking. Not with curiosity, with something deeper. Recognition. But Ethan's mind was too exhausted to question it. A passing subway train rumbled overhead somewhere in the distance. Steam curled upward from the grill into the rain-soaked night. For the first time all day, the noise inside Ethan's head began to quiet. Here, the woman said softly a few minutes later, sliding a tray toward him through the window. Careful, the plate is hot. Ethan wrapped his cold fingers around the coffee cup first. The warmth almost hurt. He took a slow sip, closing his eyes briefly as heat spread through his chest. The woman watched him carefully. Long night? She asked. Ethan let out a dry laugh under his breath. You could say that. You from around here? Not anymore. Her eyes lowered slightly at that answer. Ethan picked up a fry, suddenly realizing how hungry he truly was. He ate slower than expected, trying not to look desperate. The woman pretended to clean the counter while secretly watching every movement. Then Ethan noticed an old photograph taped near the register inside the truck. A younger version of the woman stood smiling beside a tiny silver food cart parked on a sidewalk. The cart looked dented and crooked, one wheel slightly bent inward. Ethan stared at it for a moment, a strange flicker of familiarity passing through his mind before disappearing again. That your first cart? He asked casually. The woman followed his eyes toward the photograph. For a second, emotion flashed across her face so quickly Ethan almost missed it. She nodded slowly. Yeah, she whispered. Somebody helped me keep it running once. Ethan took another sip of coffee, unaware that the woman standing across from him had spent 10 years wondering if she would ever see him again. Ethan finished the last bite slowly, almost embarrassed by how badly he had needed the meal. The warmth from the coffee lingered in his hands while rain continued dripping from the edge of the food truck roof beside him. For a few quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. The city carried on around them anyway. Car horns echoed somewhere down the avenue. A police siren faded into the distance. Steam rose from subway grates like ghosts disappearing into the cold New York night. The woman finally leaned lightly against the counter inside the truck and studied him carefully. You look exhausted, she said softly. Ethan let out a tired breath through his nose. I am. You got somewhere to stay tonight? He hesitated too long before answering. I will figure something out. She nodded slowly, as if that answer told her everything she needed to know. Ethan looked down at the empty tray in front of him. Thank you for the food, he said. I mean that. You are welcome. Her eyes softened. Everybody deserves a hot meal. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. Then his attention drifted once more toward the old photograph taped near the register. Something about it kept pulling at him. The bent wheel. The silver cart. The young woman smiling despite the obvious struggle in her eyes. He rubbed his forehead slowly. Weird, he muttered under his breath. What is? She asked gently. I feel like I have seen that cart before. The woman froze for half a second before casually reaching over and straightening the photo frame. Probably not, she said quietly. Back then nobody really noticed it. Ethan stared at the rain falling beyond the streetlight. Maybe. His voice sounded distant now. 10 years ago I noticed a lot more things than I do today. That sentence hit her harder than he realized. She looked down quickly, pretending to wipe the counter again. Ethan shifted his weight uncomfortably. His soaked coat clung cold against his shoulders. I should get going, he said at last. Wait. The word came out too fast. Ethan looked back up. The woman grabbed a paper bag and quickly filled it with extra fries and 2 wrapped sandwiches. For later, she explained before he could protest. Trust me, New York gets colder after midnight. Ethan shook his head immediately. I cannot take more free food. Sure you can. She slid the bag toward him anyway. Besides, I made too much tonight. Ethan looked at the bag for a long moment before quietly accepting it. You always this kind to strangers? He asked. The woman smiled faintly, but this time sadness flickered behind it. Only the ones who once saved my life. Ethan blinked, confused. What? She quickly looked away. Nothing. A brief silence passed between them again. Then she reached beneath the counter and grabbed an old gray hoodie folded neatly beside the register. At least take this, she said. You are freezing. Ethan stared at the hoodie in disbelief. No, it is clean. That is not the point. Then what is the point? She asked gently. Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. The truth sat heavy in his chest because he knew exactly why accepting kindness felt unbearable now. All his life, he had been the man giving things away. The powerful man. The successful man. The man people depended on. Standing here soaking wet while a food truck owner handed him leftovers, and a hoodie made him feel smaller than bankruptcy ever had. I do not even know your name, he admitted quietly. The woman looked at him for several seconds before finally answering. Claire, she said. Claire Donovan. Ethan nodded slowly. Ethan. A faint smile touched her lips. Yeah, she whispered softly, almost to herself. I know. Ethan did not notice the emotion in her voice. He only noticed the warmth of the hoodie she had placed in his hands and the strange feeling growing in his chest. For the first time since losing everything, somebody had looked at him like he still mattered. The rain had slowed to a cold drizzle by the time Ethan finally stepped away from the food truck, the paper bag tucked beneath one arm and Claire's gray hoodie hanging loosely over his shoulders. The fabric smelled faintly like coffee and smoke from the grill. Strange how something so simple could feel warmer than the $40 million penthouse he had walked out of that morning. He stopped beneath a flickering street lamp and glanced back once. Claire was still standing inside the truck watching him through the fogged-up service window. When their eyes met, she quickly looked down and pretended to rearrange condiment bottles. Ethan almost smiled again before turning away into the wet Brooklyn streets. 20 minutes later, he found himself sitting inside a 24-hour laundromat near Atlantic Avenue, trying to stay warm beside the hum of old washing machines. A homeless veteran slept in the corner beneath a newspaper blanket, while late-night customers silently folded clothes under fluorescent lights. Ethan stared down at the untouched sandwich in his hands. He should have been thinking about lawyers, bankruptcy hearings, or the investigation swallowing his company alive. Instead, all he could think about was the woman from the food truck and the strange ache in her eyes when she looked at him. It felt familiar somehow, like seeing someone remember a version of him he had forgotten himself. He leaned back against the plastic chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Then suddenly another memory surfaced without warning. Rain. A sidewalk. A silver food cart with one broken wheel. Ethan opened his eyes immediately. The image disappeared as quickly as it came. He rubbed his face slowly. Come on, he muttered under his breath. Think. But exhaustion dragged harder than memory. Across the city, Claire stood alone inside the now-quiet food truck, wiping down the grill long after midnight. She had cleaned the same spot 3 times already without realizing it. Her thoughts stayed fixed on Ethan's tired face standing beneath the streetlight asking for the cheapest thing on the menu. 10 years. 10 years she had imagined what she would say if she ever saw him again. And tonight, when fate finally placed him in front of her, she could barely breathe. Claire walked to the small shelf near the register and carefully picked up an old rusted wrench wrapped inside a faded kitchen towel. She ran her thumb across the worn metal slowly. Back then she had been 23 years old, sleeping inside her broken food cart after losing her apartment. Nobody stopped to help. Nobody except one man in an expensive black coat who had stepped out of a town car during a storm and crouched in the rain beside her ruined wheel without caring what his shoes cost. You cannot sell food with a broken axle, he had said casually while tightening bolts with this exact wrench. She still remembered the steam rising from his breath in the cold air. The way he smiled without pity. The $5,000 check he quietly folded into her hand afterward. Everybody deserves one second chance, he had told her before driving away. Claire had cried inside the cart for an hour after that night. Not because of the money, because somebody powerful had looked at her like she was still human. Now, the same man who once saved her future was sleeping somewhere alone in New York with nowhere to go. Claire swallowed hard and looked toward the empty street outside the truck window. Then she made a decision. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. Ethan woke stiff and sore inside the laundromat chair just before sunrise. His neck burned from sleeping upright. For a few confused seconds he forgot where he was. Then reality settled back onto his shoulders like concrete. He checked his phone out of habit before remembering it was still dead. The laundromat owner turned the television volume louder near the counter. Ethan froze when his own face appeared on the screen beside another breaking headline. Former billionaire under federal investigation. Analysts debated his downfall while stock market graphics flashed behind them. One commentator actually laughed. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Rough morning, a familiar voice asked softly from the doorway behind him. Ethan turned in surprise. Claire stood there holding 2 coffees and a paper bag filled with breakfast sandwiches, snowflakes melting in her blonde hair. Claire stepped inside the laundromat carefully, the morning cold following her through the glass door. Ethan straightened immediately when he saw her, almost embarrassed to be found sleeping in a plastic chair beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Around them, dryers rumbled softly while the smell of detergent mixed with burned coffee from an old vending machine near the wall. Claire held out one of the paper cups toward him. "You look like you need this more than I do," she said gently. Ethan accepted it with both hands. "You really did not have to come all the way back here. I was already nearby." The lie came too quickly, but Ethan was too exhausted to notice. Claire sat beside him quietly, placing the breakfast bag between them. Bacon, egg, and cheese sandwiches still warm from the grill filled the air with comfort Ethan had not realized he missed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The television continued replaying financial headlines overhead. Ethan's face flashed across the screen again beside words like collapse, fraud, and disgrace. Claire glanced toward the television, then calmly reached for the remote near the counter and muted it without asking. Ethan stared down at his coffee. "You should not waste your kindness on me," he said quietly. Claire looked at him carefully. "Why?" Ethan let out a hollow laugh. "Because everybody else already figured out I am not worth much anymore." Her expression tightened slightly at that. "Do you really believe money is the only thing that made you valuable?" Ethan did not answer right away. A few months ago, he would have called the question ridiculous. Of course, status mattered. Success mattered. Winning mattered. His entire life had been built on that belief. But sitting here in wet shoes beside a woman serving breakfast from a paper bag, he suddenly realized how quickly the world erased people once their money disappeared. "Honestly," he admitted softly, "I do not know anymore." Claire watched him for several seconds before speaking again. "Come work with me today." Ethan blinked in surprise. "What? At the truck?" "Claire, I could use help. You barely know me." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Maybe more than you think." Ethan frowned slightly at that answer. Claire quickly opened the breakfast bag and handed him a sandwich before he could question her further. "Eat first," she said. "Then argue." Against his own expectations, Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. The sound surprised both of them. It had been weeks since Claire heard genuine warmth in his voice, and years since Ethan himself had. 2 hours later, Ethan stood awkwardly inside the cramped food truck kitchen wearing a black apron that read Second Chance Kitchen across the front. The morning rush had already started outside. Construction workers, delivery drivers, nurses ending overnight shifts. Claire moved confidently between the grill and counter while Ethan tried to stay out of the way. "Okay," Claire said while tying her apron tighter. "Rule number 1. Never touch the fryer basket without gloves." Ethan nodded seriously. "Understood." "Rule number 2. Smile at customers." "That one sounds harder." Claire laughed softly. "You will survive." The truck shook slightly each time someone stepped up to the service window. Ethan found himself taking orders while Claire cooked. At first his voice sounded stiff and unnatural. "1 cheeseburger," he repeated carefully. "No onions." But something strange happened as the hours passed. Nobody here cared about Forbes lists or billion-dollar acquisitions. They cared about coffee being hot, fries being fresh, someone remembering their name after a 12-hour shift. A firefighter wearing a navy jacket stepped to the window around noon and smiled at Claire. You hired help finally? Claire glanced toward Ethan. Temporary help. The firefighter looked Ethan over. You got lucky, man. She is the only person in Brooklyn who still gives free pie on Fridays. Ethan looked at Claire in surprise. You give away free pie? Claire shrugged casually while flipping burgers. Some people need a reason to keep going at the end of the week. The sentence hit Ethan unexpectedly hard. He watched her for a long second while snow drifted softly beyond the truck windows. Then another flash of memory crossed his mind. Rain pouring onto a sidewalk. A young woman crying beside a broken food cart. And his own voice saying softly, everybody deserves one second chance. By the end of the week, Ethan no longer looked like the man who had walked into Second Chance Kitchen, soaked by rain and humiliation. He still carried exhaustion in his eyes, but something softer had begun replacing the emptiness there. Every morning before sunrise, he helped Claire unlock the truck and haul supplies from the storage garage down the block. He learned how to refill propane tanks, prep vegetables, stack soda crates, and remember regular customers by name. It was messy work. Grease stained his sleeves. His back ached constantly. And somehow, for the first time in years, his mind felt quiet. Snow fell steadily over Brooklyn one evening as the dinner rush finally slowed. Claire leaned against the counter counting cash, while Ethan wiped down tables outside beneath the string lights hanging over the truck. A little girl wearing a pink winter coat waved excitedly at Ethan through the service window before leaving with her father. Bye, burger guy, she shouted happily. Ethan laughed under his breath and waved back. Claire watched him carefully from inside the truck. You know, she said once the sidewalk emptied again, people like you better now. Ethan glanced up in confusion. Now, Claire smiled faintly. Before, people admired you because you were powerful. That is different. Ethan leaned against the counter beside her, folding the towel slowly in his hands. You think I was a bad person before? No, Claire answered honestly. I think you forgot how to see people who could not do anything for you. That sentence stayed with Ethan longer than he expected. Later that night, they sat together on the curb behind the truck, sharing leftover fries from a paper tray, while traffic rolled past on the wet street nearby. Steam rose from the city, drains into the freezing air. Ethan looked down at the food in his hands thoughtfully. You know something weird? He said quietly. Claire turned toward him. What? I have eaten more meals with actual people this week than I did the entire last year. Claire smiled softly, but did not interrupt. Ethan stared ahead at the glowing skyline in the distance. My dinners used to happen in private rooms with investors and politicians. Everybody smiling. Everybody pretending. Half the time nobody even touched the food. He shook his head slowly. And somehow eating cold fries on a sidewalk feels more honest than any of it. Claire lowered her eyes, hiding the emotion in them. Sometimes losing things clears the noise, she said softly. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her. The snowflakes melting into strands of blonde hair near her cheeks. The tiredness in her posture after working 14 straight hours. The kindness she gave people without making them feel small for needing it. He realized suddenly that Claire never treated struggling people like burdens. She treated them like human beings passing through a hard chapter. The thought settled deep inside him. Why are you helping me? He asked quietly. Claire froze almost imperceptibly. Ethan continued before she could answer. Seriously, most people would enjoy watching me fail right now. Claire looked down at her hands for a long moment. Not everybody, she whispered. Ethan studied her carefully. You keep saying things like you know me. Claire forced a small smile. Maybe I just know what it feels like when the world stops seeing you. Before Ethan could respond, the lights inside the truck suddenly flickered once and went dark completely. Great, Claire muttered, standing quickly. Not again. Ethan followed her inside, while she opened a small cabinet beneath the sink searching for a flashlight. Generator problem? He asked automatically. I think so. Usually I kick it until it works. Ethan almost laughed. That is probably not the official repair method. Claire handed him a flashlight. You got a better idea, burger guy? Ethan crouched beside the old generator compartment at the back of the truck while Claire held the light above him. He loosened the side panel carefully, and the moment the flashlight beam hit the rusted metal inside, his breathing stopped. Bolted beside the engine was a faded silver wrench marked with tiny scratched initials. Ethan stared at it in complete silence while rainwater dripped softly from the truck roof outside. Claire watched him carefully, her heart pounding harder with every passing second. Slowly, Ethan reached toward the wrench like a man touching a ghost from another lifetime. Ethan slowly lifted the old wrench from inside the generator compartment, his fingers tightening around the cold metal as memories rushed back all at once. Rain pouring onto cracked pavement. A younger woman kneeling beside a damaged food cart with tears running down her face. His own expensive coat soaked through while he crouched beside a bent axle under a broken streetlight. Claire stood frozen beside him inside the dark food truck, barely breathing now. Ethan turned the wrench over carefully in his hands until the scratched initials caught the flashlight beam again. EW. His initials. No way, he whispered. His voice sounded distant, almost disbelieving. Then he looked up at Claire slowly. Really looked at her. The same eyes. The same soft sadness behind her smile. Suddenly the photograph near the register, the broken wheel. The strange familiarity in her voice all slammed together in his mind at once. The cart, he said quietly. You were the woman with the broken cart. Claire swallowed hard but nodded. Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. 10 years ago. Yeah. Outside Lexington Avenue. In the rain, she whispered softly. Ethan sat back against the side of the truck like the weight of the realization had physically hit him. Oh my God. Claire gave a small emotional laugh despite herself. You finally remember. Ethan ran a hand over his face slowly. I thought I imagined that memory. His eyes drifted back to the wrench in his hands. I cannot believe you kept this. Claire looked down shyly. You fixed the wheel yourself. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath, overwhelmed now. Claire, I barely even knew what I was doing. You stayed anyway. The silence between them changed after that. Softer now. Warmer. Like two people finally standing in the same moment after years apart. Ethan leaned against the counter, still holding the wrench carefully. Why did you never tell me? Claire hesitated before answering. Because the first night you came to the truck, you looked broken. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. And I did not want you to feel like you owed me something just because you once helped me. That sentence landed deep in his chest. Ethan looked around the truck slowly. The glowing string lights. The handwritten menus. The old photograph. This entire life existed because of one rainy night he barely remembered. I gave you one check, he said quietly. Claire shook her head immediately. No. You gave me dignity. Ethan looked up at her again. Claire smiled softly through the emotion gathering in her eyes. Everybody else treated me like I was invisible back then. You did not. Ethan had spent most of his life believing success came from strategy, intelligence, and discipline. But standing inside this tiny food truck, he suddenly realized one small act of kindness had built something more meaningful than half the skyscrapers carrying his company name. Before he could speak again, headlights suddenly swept across the truck windows from outside. Claire glanced toward the street. A black luxury SUV slowly stopped near the curb. Ethan immediately recognized the vehicle model. Expensive, corporate, familiar. Two men stepped out wearing tailored wool coats while snow drifted through the night air around them. Claire frowned slightly. Friends of yours? Ethan's entire posture tightened instantly. No. One of the men looked directly toward the truck window and immediately spotted Ethan standing inside wearing an apron. Recognition flashed across his face. There he is, the man muttered to his partner. Ethan's stomach dropped. Damn it. Claire looked between them in confusion as the two men approached the service window. The taller man forced a polished corporate smile. Mr. Walker, he said smoothly. We have been trying to find you for days. Ethan's face hardened immediately. I'm not interested. The man ignored him and glanced around the small food truck with obvious discomfort before lowering his voice. The board wants to discuss a settlement before the federal hearings begin. Claire quietly stepped closer beside Ethan without realizing she had done it. The second man looked Ethan over in the black apron and gave a faint smirk. Did not expect to find you flipping burgers in Brooklyn. Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Claire folded her arms calmly and looked straight at the men through the service window. Funny, she said softly, because this is the first honest work he has probably done in years. The taller executive stared at Claire in disbelief, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by someone standing inside a food truck wearing an apron dusted with flour. Snow drifted slowly between the glowing streetlights outside, while silence tightened across the small kitchen. Ethan immediately stepped forward. Claire, he said quietly. It is okay. But Claire did not move away. Her eyes stayed fixed calmly on the two men outside the service window. You heard him, she said evenly. He is not interested. The second executive gave a dry laugh beneath his breath. You do not understand the situation, ma'am. No, Claire replied softly. I think I do. Ethan rubbed a hand across his forehead. Exhausted already by the sight of tailored coats and polished corporate smiles invading the peaceful little world he had finally started building here. What do you want? He asked flatly. The taller man adjusted his gloves before answering. The board is preparing testimony for the federal inquiry. Some members are willing to shift responsibility entirely onto you unless an agreement is reached. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Of course they are. There is also the matter of your remaining assets. There are no remaining assets. Not officially. The implication hung in the cold air between them. Ethan's face darkened instantly. You think I hid money? We think desperate men make desperate decisions. Claire looked sharply at the executives. You people destroyed his company, and now you want him to clean up your mess. The taller man gave her a thin corporate smile. With respect, this conversation is beyond your understanding. Ethan expected Claire to step back after that. Instead, she leaned her elbows calmly onto the service counter and said the one thing none of them expected. I know exactly what men like you understand. The executive frowned. Claire's voice stayed soft but steady. You only respected him when he made you rich. Neither man answered. Snowflakes drifted silently between the truck and the black SUV parked at the curb. Ethan stood very still beside her. And now, Claire continued quietly, you see a man wearing an apron and suddenly you think he is worthless. The second executive scoffed. Look around. He lost everything. Claire glanced toward Ethan briefly before answering. No. He lost things that were never really his. Ethan lowered his eyes at that, something tightening painfully in his chest. Because deep down he knew she was right. The board, the investors, the luxury, the people applauding him at charity galas and rooftop parties. Most of them disappeared the second the money vanished. But Claire stayed. Claire saw him sleeping in a laundromat and still brought him breakfast the next morning. The taller executive finally sighed impatiently. Mr. Walker, if you refuse to cooperate, the hearings next month will become very unpleasant. Ethan looked at the man for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. For the first time since losing Walker Global, fear did not rise inside him. Not because his problems disappeared. Not because the investigation magically went away. But because standing inside this little truck beside Claire suddenly mattered more than protecting the remains of his old empire. Ethan slowly untied the black apron from around his waist and folded it carefully onto the counter. Claire's expression immediately changed. Ethan, I am not going back to that world tonight, he said softly to her. Then he turned toward the executives again. Tell the board they can speak to my attorney in the morning. The taller man frowned. That is your final answer? Ethan glanced around the truck one last time. The glowing string lights. The smell of fresh bread and grilled onions. Claire standing beside the register with concern written across her face. A place built from kindness instead of ego. He realized suddenly that this tiny food truck felt more like home than his penthouse ever did. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. The executives exchanged irritated looks before finally turning away toward the SUV. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared into the snowy Brooklyn streets. Silence settled over the block again. Claire looked at Ethan carefully once the taillights vanished. You did not have to walk away from that because of me. Ethan let out a tired breath and picked up the apron again slowly. I did not walk away because of you. He met her eyes gently. I walked away because for the first time in years, I finally remembered who I used to be. 1 year later, snow fell softly across Brooklyn again, covering the sidewalks in silver while warm lights spilled from the windows of a renovated brick building on the corner of Atlantic Avenue. A glowing sign above the entrance read Second Chance Community Kitchen. Inside, the sound of laughter, clinking dishes, and quiet conversation filled the large open space where dozens of people sat eating hot meals beneath hanging string lights. Construction workers shared tables beside single mothers. Elderly veterans drank coffee. Near college students studying with headphones around their necks. Nobody was rushed. Nobody was judged. On one wall hung an old framed photograph of a tiny silver food cart with one broken wheel. Beneath it, engraved into a small brass plate, were the words, "One act of kindness can change a life forever." Ethan stood near the kitchen counter wearing dark jeans and a black sweater with rolled sleeves, helping carry trays toward the serving line while steam rose from giant pots of soup behind him. The expensive watches and tailored suits were gone now. So was the constant tension that once lived permanently in his shoulders. He still attended hearings related to Walker Global from time to time, but most of the accusations against him had quietly unraveled once evidence revealed the board had hidden financial losses long before the collapse. Reporters occasionally still chased him for statements. Investors still offered meetings. Some even offered him chances to rebuild another empire. Ethan declined every single one. Because somewhere between burnt coffee, snow-covered sidewalks, and late nights inside a food truck, he had discovered something worth more than being rich. Across the room, Claire laughed softly while helping an elderly man carry his dinner tray toward a table near the windows. Ethan paused without realizing it just to watch her for a second. She looked different now too. Lighter somehow. Less guarded. The woman who once slept inside a broken food cart had built something beautiful out of compassion instead of fear. And somehow she had rebuilt Ethan at the same time. "You are staring again," Claire teased gently as she walked back toward him. Ethan smiled without embarrassment. Still allowed to. Claire rolled her eyes playfully before handing him a clipboard full of supply orders. "We are running low on potatoes again. That is because apparently feeding half of Brooklyn was your brilliant idea." "Our idea," she corrected softly. Ethan glanced around the crowded room. Volunteers moved between tables refilling coffee cups, while soft jazz played from old speakers near the kitchen entrance. It was messy, loud, imperfect, and somehow it felt more successful than every luxury hotel Ethan had ever opened. A young man around 20 stepped nervously through the front doors carrying a backpack and looking freezing cold from the weather outside. Ethan recognized the expression immediately. Embarrassment mixed with hunger, fear mixed with pride. The exact same look he had carried into Claire's food truck 1 year earlier. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed a tray and walked over. "You eaten yet?" he asked gently. The young man shook his head awkwardly. "I do not really have money right now." Ethan smiled softly. "First meal is free." Across the room, Claire froze for half a second, hearing the familiar words. Their eyes met instantly. Ethan gave her the smallest smile, and Claire felt tears quietly sting behind her eyes. Because 10 years ago, one exhausted businessman stopped beside a broken food cart in the rain and treated a struggling woman like she still mattered. And now that single moment had become this place. These people. This life. Later that night, after everyone left and the kitchen lights dimmed low, Ethan and Claire stepped outside into the softly falling snow. The city looked peaceful around them. Quiet. Claire locked the front door while Ethan pulled her gently closer beneath the warm glow of the entrance light. "You know," he said softly, "losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me." Claire smiled up at him. "Because you met me again?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Because you reminded me who I was before the world taught me to measure people by money." Claire's expression softened completely at that. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out the old silver wrench with the scratched initials still visible across the handle. Claire laughed quietly through tears the moment she saw it. "You still carry that thing?" "Every day." He turned the wrench slowly in his hand before looking back at her. "Best investment I ever made." Then beneath the falling Brooklyn snow, beside the little community kitchen built from second chances, Ethan kissed her softly while warm light glowed behind them like home.